All right. Yay. Good evening, everyone. Our live stream works now. We are on. So good evening, everyone here in the room and wherever at home you are. I am happy to welcome you to our Welcome Change on Rural Innovation tonight. My name is Constanze Frischen. I am the head of Ashoka here in the US. And I'm still always a little bit surprised when I hear myself say that because I'm also a recent immigrant. I came to the US 3 years ago from Europe with my family. It was a big adventure. We were excited, we were anxious. We had to find a new home, a new school for the kids. They didn't speak any English, so we were nervous. The experience, though, was wonderful. Everyone was welcoming, they embraced us, the kids loved their new neighborhood school, and we felt at home in 1, 2, 3. However, at the same time, this news cycle started to take off. We read a lot about the US as a country divided, there being outrage and fear and exasperation. And people from back home in Europe were asking, where have you gotten yourself into? What is going on? So Ashoka US had made a commitment back then to expand its network of fellows, of social entrepreneurs, not just along the coast, but across the country as a whole, into the Midwest, across the South. And so I had the opportunity to travel and to the privileged position to get to know the country through a lens of solution. And what I can tell you is that I didn't find outrage and despair. I found rural America to be super interesting and to be a source of innovation and solutions. And you'll be hearing from 4 innovators tonight who will make this come alive. For me, 3 things were relevant or stood out for me. First, great solutions often come from places where problems are most acutely felt. Because there, the innovators understand the complexity of the problem and they know the makeup of the community. Second, great solutions are not just about innovation. They are as much about participation. So they bring community members in, they give them a voice, they make them change makers, as co-creators of the solutions. And third, what works for rural America might as well work for America as a whole. It's not working? This is better? Ha. Okay, I hope you understood what I was saying. All right, so what works for rural America might as well work for the country as a whole. With that being said, I am, ready to cede the stage to the panel. But first, I want to introduce our host and our moderator for tonight. We could have gotten no one better than James Fallows, a longtime writer for The Atlantic. He has reported from all over the world, lived for many years in China and Japan. But what is relevant for tonight is that since 2013, he and his wife, Deborah, have been traveling to smaller towns in rural America to report on both the challenges and the successes there. They've written a best-selling book about that called Our Towns, and right now they're making a documentary with HBO. 2 days ago, they were still filming in Mississippi. Tonight they are here. Thank you for coming. Over to you, James.
I'm letting this suspend. We all know the phrase fiat lux. What's the Latin equivalent for let there not be sound? That would be somebody can come up with that, I think, in a crowd like this. Thank you so much, Constanze. Thank you to Ashoka. Thanks to you all for coming this evening and those who are joining us via live stream. I am really delighted to be here for this next hour of conversation here and then some time for questions with our excellent panelists talking about the ideas for renewing America. that are coming from small towns and rural America, there could not be a more important topic for the country in general, and one that is more interesting for me personally. Also for my wife, Deb, who sends her best wishes. She's not allowed to be here in her lovely body, but she's here in her spirit. I'll try to channel herself. The reason why this matters so much for the country, as you know, is that from the national panorama, almost everything about our economics, our politics, our culture now is described in shorthand as a divide between the biggest cities and the smallest cities, between the coast and the interior, between people in so-called red and blue states with that oversimplified description. We think about the directions for investment and the opportunities for new jobs and the kinds of mobility that people have. There is, as I think people here well know, it's easy to slide in our popular discourse from treating rural America and small town America from areas that often have problems to areas that are a problem. And that distinction, that shift often enters our discourse. And I think we're going to hear from our panelists about places that have problems but are not problems. In fact, are solutions themselves for the kind of creativity that is going on. The personal reason why this is so interesting and compelling to me is, as Costanza said, for the last 6 years, Deb and I have been traveling in non-coastal America to see the way people have been engaged with the problems they certainly have, from economic dislocation to opioid challenge to racial justice to every other thing that's so well familiar. And what has struck us is how simultaneously people are aware of the difficulties they face, but empowered and feeling as if they are in a situation where they can come up with answers that generally are not recognized on the national scene. And I'll just give you one illustration, and I'll stop my talking in a minute, but one illustration that really struck me. How many people here have been to Muncie, Indiana? You know, it was the original middle town from the famous sociological study. It's not a small town by the standards of anybody here. It's a town of less than 100,000. Muncie, Indiana has undertaken a radical experiment in public schooling over the past year, where the public schools were in such crisis that the university there, Ball State University, has taken over the public schools. This is something with one precedent in American history that I know of, which was BU taking over the Chelsea schools in Boston 20 or 25 years ago, but that was a private university. As best I can tell, this has not happened before, of a public university taking over public schools, and there has not been one word written about this in the national press. I mean, the Atlantic has had an item out, I will point out, but our national newspapers, the national broadcast networks, I think the Chronicle of Higher Education today has an item. But this is an illustration of the kind of innovation and renewal and experimentation that's happening in places much smaller than Muncie, but is happening with the same kind of lack of attention to what is happening there. So we're going to try to remedy that this evening with a fascinating panel of people who, in small places around the country, are having innovative experiments that some of you may be aware of. The country in general is not as aware as it should be. And from these local experiments, lots of national and international potential is possible. So I'm going to ask the panelists to talk about what they're doing, explore some of the implications, what's working well, what isn't, what is scalable, how Ashoka has affected their plans. And after they've discussed among themselves, we'll have a chance for you all to ask questions. So that is the plan for the next while. I'm going to introduce, I'll start on the far end from my perspective. I'll just name each person and then a brief description, and then I'll start asking them about what they're doing. On the far end from me is Stacey Epperson of Next Step in Kentucky. You're from small town Kentucky, but you're now living in Louisville, right? And she is part of a radical experiment in housing to make affordable housing safer, of higher. Somebody has to come up with that reverse fiat looks pretty soon. We'll see if that does the job. So she's going to tell us what she's doing on the housing front and why that matters and what it could mean for the rest of the country. Next area is Brandon Dennison of Coalfield Development in West Virginia, who's been part of an innovative effort to bring to economic monocultures and places that have suffered from boom and bust cycles, the kind of diverse economy that can make use of the talents people have had there and have them feel as if they are empowered for an economic future. Next to him is Denisa Livingston of the Dene Community Advocacy Alliance for the Navajo Nation, who has been involved in a unprecedented, I think, or at least very interesting effort to improve nutrition and public health for her people, again with implications around the country. And next to her is Reginaldo Haslett-Marroquín from the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance in Minnesota, who has a plan I bet not many of you here have heard of for having sustainable, scalable, more natural agriculture. And I'll let you fill in the details from that. So why don't we start in the same order? Start with you, Stacey. Tell us in a minute or two, essentially, what you're doing, why it's unusual, and what its implications are.
Okay, good evening. So our work, I'm the founder of Next Step. It's a mission to provide sustainable home ownership, but we're out to transform the manufactured housing industry. About 22 million people live in these homes. A lot of people in rural America live in manufactured homes. I grew up in a place called Possum Trough. And so in Appalachia, manufactured housing, what I said done wrong, was part of my landscape. Where homes didn't have foundations and maybe they didn't qualify for good loans, and families experienced homes that were older, disrepair, and they were having a hard time paying them off. So I looked at a problem, tried to find a solution, and all I asked was, how do you do it right? Well, to me, that was a really high-quality, Energy Star manufactured home, preparing and supporting families with good home buyer education and counseling, and finding them a fair loan. 80% of these loans in this industry go out as personal properties, so they carry high interest rates. All we had to do was get them a mortgage. Sounds simple, right? But what I found was we had to really kind of rebuild a whole idea of doing something differently that was innovated in Appalachia, and then started moving across the country with lots of partners. So it's about working within an industry and nonprofits to get this work done.
Trying to be careful with the sound system. So if you could just say one word more about why is your approach better for the people who are living in these houses than it was before?
Sure. So I think it's really about taking what might be a negative investment and making it a positive investment. And so getting more value to the customer at the end of the day. So what we do is set them up for a trajectory to earn wealth, okay? And so first of all, getting the house Energy Star, so we're saving the families 30% on their utility bills. We're getting them into a mortgage. The combination of energy and the savings on a loan can save them as much as $300 a month. And for families who are earning less than $30,000 a year, that's significant, right? It's not only the individual, but it's the community. We're building rural communities, right? So I was looking at a landscape of homes falling apart. Homes built before 1976 were falling, homes were in a lot of disrepair, and there are 2 million people living in these old homes, and this is before the government regulated them. So what we do is tackle that, help replace that, and get better investments out for families and communities.
Thank you very much. Brandon, now tell us what you're doing in West Virginia and how you're trying to bring economic diversity to an area that has very dramatically lacked it.
We are essentially trying to rebuild the Appalachian economy from the ground up. And the way we do that is we incubate social enterprises in diversified markets of the economy. So we are in a place that's been very dependent on one industry for a long time. And so our strategy is purposely diversified to try and show tangibly what a new way forward could look like. We helped incubate the first solar company in southern West Virginia. We have a licensed general contracting business that contributes to energy efficiency for housing units. We have a sustainable woodworking and furniture making company. We even have a manufacturing company that makes shirts out of 100% recycled materials and has a license with Major League Baseball to do that. So, and what ties all of these together is we use those social enterprises as an avenue to put people back to work. People who are facing people who are facing barriers to employment, we can use those social enterprises to get back on track. So we set out to rebuild the Appalachian economy. I think we're realizing now that our approach has important implications for workforce development generally. You know, in a rural setting, job training really is not that valuable because it's often not leading to an actual job because the communities become so distressed that there just aren't a lot of businesses and employment bases around. And so what we've realized is that you have to do, at least in a rural setting, you have to do the two together. Yes, you need to train a modern workforce, but you have to be developing the new diversified businesses that can employ that workforce.
Question for you too. When my wife Deb was writing about the town of Eastport, Maine, she said they had a deliberate linguistic exercise. They often describe themselves with D terms: decay, deterioration, despair, demise, and they shifted those to re terms: renewal, renaissance, reinvigorate. You use the re term extensively. Say a word about that if you would.
We do. For example, our agriculture business is Refresh Appalachia. Our construction business is Revitalize Appalachia. What we're getting at with that, we're not trying to turn Appalachia into something that it's not. We're actually saying, okay, let's get back to the basics. What are we really good at? What are we most proud of? What are our assets, and how can we build off of that? And so in many respects, it's a return to who we really are.
Tell us about what you are doing in the Navajo Nation, the origin. You come from a family that's historically been very involved in public affairs for your nation. Tell us what you're doing and what effects you've had.
Yeah, first of all, I'd just like to introduce myself in my language, acknowledge that the indigenous land that we are on. And traditionally, we introduce ourselves in our language, and my language, Dene. Yad she Denisa Livingston and she Kilachini Nashin Tishidana Abashichin, Ose Dana Tachini Dashache, Don Anish Eja Tachini Dashanella. I see that Nasha A Teragon will yet diaquat adi and Nishila. So introduce my clan. I come from a matrilineal matriarchal heritage, and my mother's clan that we pass forth is the Red Running into Water clan, which is very significant in the Southwest. You can see the red dirt, the red mud running to the water. And this is where I come from New Mexico. And part of the work that I'm leading is really giving our community members a place and a sense of purpose in addressing something that has never been a part of our diet. And historically, 150 years ago, the U.S. government sent our Dene people to a concentration camp in Bosque Redondo where sugar, salt, and flour canned foods were introduced. And so to this day, we still have 99% lack of healthy food, nutritious food. We have 1% access to healthy food and therefore have a high rate of diabetes. Every Navajo family is affected by diabetes. We have seen that from the children all the way to the elders. And so what we have created, and some of you may know our work, is really something that was never part of our diet, that even those words did not exist. So quote unquote junk food, something that did not exist even in our language because it wasn't our identity. And so we had to create that language, Iyan Bajol, Iyan meaning food, but Bajol meaning the oppressive food, the scrap food, the fast casual food, the unhealthy food, the processed food, all of those meanings, the prison food, and all of those foods that are not one with us and is not part of our being. And so what we've been able to do is address really our food. And here I have this here is Iyan Yahat Egi E Inna It's Eh. And that is healthy food is life. And healthy food is who we are as Indigenous people. Healthy food for everyone here is part of our identity. It is medicine. And so what we have done, and some of you know our work, is really passing the U.S.'s first junk food tax or unhealthy foods tax. And so it's called the Healthy Nation Act of 2014. And at the end of 2017, we've been able to generate over 4.1 million at partial compliance. And we've been able to introduce another sister law because everything comes in pairs. And so we've been able to eliminate tax on healthy food with emphasis on our cultural foods. And so some of the foods that where I come from is the sumac berry and also the juniper ash and all of the corn here, like I have here in my necklace. This is who we are. And so embracing that and knowing that, calling out unhealthy food, calling out the quote unquote junk food, that there's no such thing, right? That there's junk and there's food. But yet, this is what we're really addressing and also implementing in our culture. And so I'm really excited to be here and really excited to also be the voice for this, because as Indigenous women and where I come from, that the women are the leaders, that the women are the ones, who are stepping into these roles of justice and addressing food justice and food sovereignty and being the ones to be seed savers and seed keepers. And so I'm really excited. I know my mother's watching and my grandmother's almost 90 years old, and she's the one teaching us this knowledge and this wisdom that we're passing forth and addressing taxation and unhealthy foods. So thank you.
Thank you. And I have one follow-up. It's not me. I have one follow-up question for you. Over the years, Deb and I have often been to Ajo, Arizona, which is near the Tohono O'odham Nation, and the Tohono O'odham people they've developed a real business in some of their native foods. They have a serious diabetes problem as well, but they've had a real emphasis on having a different kind of cuisine and also propagating it through Arizona. My question is whether there is any kind of nationwide alliance among various tribal groups to try to make this a larger movement.
That's a very interesting question, because us as Indigenous people, there's so much diversity. People try to put us in one pot, but there's a lot of diversity that we're also learning about one another, just like you're here learning about us. And so we've created something called the Slow Food Turtle Island Association, representing Indigenous North America, Canada, US, and Mexico. And we're uniting with other tribes, and even some of the funding that helped us in our initiatives came from the Shakopee Metawakitan tribe. And so some of the support here and some of the conversation are now existing and are leveraged now because of an unhealthy foods tax is a vehicle to channel those conversations. And so it is very critical that we are building alliances, but not only here in the States, internationally. That is Indigenous peoples. We have the International Terra Madre Network, which is an international Indigenous network. And so we are building these channels and building these conversations and opportunities for us to promote food sovereignty.
Thank you. And now, maybe I'll stand over here. In this first round, I'll have a next question for Rehi. Tell us what your regenerative agriculture alliance is doing, because it's an approach I think many people here will find very interesting.
All right. Thank you. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes. Bienvenidos. I appreciate that opportunity to be here with you all. And I won't do that long introduction. So basically, here's something that very few of us understand about our food. Basically, all it is energy, right? So we understand the concept of energy, but we don't understand how food is actually the energy that regenerates us every single day. Our cells, our immune system, our gut microflora, all of that. If you change the food, you change everything. It is a tool of colonization because of that. Because if you change the food and the diet, and even in some cases, part of the warfare strategy of conquering forces has been to destroy the food sources, whether it was corn in Latin America and Guatemala, especially for the Mayans, or if it was amaranth for the Aztecs, or was the food sources for you. It's always been used like that. So basically, what we don't understand is that on one end of the spectrum, you got unedible energy in the form of natural chemicals, organic or not, in the air, CO2, ammonia, and all that. And then there's a process of transformation of that energy, which we farmers are stewards of, sometimes responsibly and sometimes very irresponsibly, which I will say degenerative or regeneratively. And so that process is what delivers that food in our plate. The integrity of that food in terms of our spiritual, physical, and mental health comes out of that process. When we disregard that energy transformation, we degenerate the landscape, we degenerate the water, we degenerate the oceans, life in general, and as a result, we degenerate ourselves. So my work on this has been to enter this large space with a single entry point. You know, in systems change, you have to pick one thing you're gonna do. So the first thing we did was figure out what was first, the chicken or the egg. Chickens, we chose chickens because you have to have...
Finally, an answer.
Yes. You have to have livestock to regenerate the soil, to regenerate the plants and all of that, and to regenerate ourselves in many ways. Now, you don't have to eat them, but you have to have animals in the landscape. And the best way to enter this space was with chickens because they are the common denominator to the over 500 million farmers around the world that grow over 70% of the food that we eat today, according to the UN. Now, that's why we pick chickens, nothing personal with the chicken. So the next thing then was, just like what you said at the beginning, you know, okay, what is the system doing with it, with chickens? And we found out that it has degenerated to the point that we can't call the chickens in the market food anymore. And so what was our departing point was then to go back into history and see how did the chicken come to be and what would make a chicken happy, you know, really. And so the process of doing that took us back into native, original, aboriginal wisdom, brought all of that forward, and we engineer a process by which we can restore the natural habitat to the chicken worldwide and grow chickens that are worth eating. So that was phase one. Once we finished that engineering, it took a while, then we moved into phase two, which is the Regenerative Agriculture Alliance, which is bring all of that into a larger ecosystem, partnering with other sectors that are doing similar work, and now create a potentially national and globally impacting ecosystem where we get to manage the process by which we scale up these ideas so you can have great food. The process of transforming energy can be brought to its original integrity, and farmers and chickens can be happy again.
And so a brief follow-up there. Can you tell us where this is in action yet? If we wanted to go see your chickens, where would we go?
Yes, we protect them a lot, so they're still wild, you know, so they don't like many visitors. But we do have an operation, my unit, production unit as we call them, because we engineer a production unit so we can then scale up from there, just like in any other system. So I have one in my backyard. It's the original one. It's got the most developed natural habitat. And then we have operations around Northfield, Minnesota that you can go visit. We also established a partnership with the Lakota and Pine Ridge. So we have another operation there where we are already feeding a lot of families. I mean, they are feeding a lot of families. Another operation in San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, and two operations in two different regions of indigenous communities in Guatemala. And then also in the Nariño region in Colombia, you can find a different version of our system that we transfer to our brothers and sisters down there. Those are basically the places you can go see it at this point.
Thank you. I'll do another round. I guess I'll try the same order this time, then I'll try to surprise you after that, which is asking each of you to, as you are even more acutely aware than I am, there's a view in the national press and national politics that rural areas and small towns are to be sort of humored and condescended to, but don't really matter that much. You know, if they get angry politically, you pay attention to them. They're not where people go for opportunity. They're not sort of the center of the action. Tell us why to an audience, a national audience watching this live stream, why it matters, what you're doing, for example, in Kentucky.
Okay. Why does it matter? Well, one, I think we're all interconnected, right? So what you're eating, your fuel, so we have to have that. Your energy in urban America, we're extracting that from rural America, right? So we're very important, okay? So we are the large land mass, but we may be fewer in population. I would say communities just really matter though, right? I think in each of us we have a sense of place and belonging. For me, that core is home, right? Think about your memories of home, the home that you're providing for your kids. That's all across America, right? And I think we have this connection to land. So for instance, Appalachia, I mean, that connection's really strong, right? And these are vibrant communities, and there's a culture in these communities across America that's worth saving, right? And so I think I can't imagine the U.S. without rural America.
So Brandon, you're up. Tell us why it matters nationally or internationally what you're doing in West Virginia.
Our state and our region, we have given so much already, and we have so much more still to give. So our country really got where it is in large part because of the fuel and the food. When I'm talking fuel, I'm talking coal that came from rural America, and in my home state, in that instance, West Virginia. Now, I think a lot of times you had a great line earlier about problems, people who have problems being treated like they are a problem. And so what pops to mind for me is climate change. I think a lot of times, people, I think sometimes in the national narrative, coal communities are treated as if having an outsized contribution to climate change. All we ever did was meet demand. Coal miners supplied demand for people who wanted to turn the lights on and operate their factories and industrialize this country. We're no more responsible for it than the rest of us. However, I think rural communities have a uniquely important and critical role to play in combating climate change. And I think we have a lot of skill sets that really can contribute to an entrepreneurial revolution in this country. We know how to make stuff, we fix stuff, we grow stuff, we build stuff. That's what you build an economy off of in a healthy way.
Thank you. Denisa, you represent one nation here, or maybe two nations, the United States and Navajo Nation. Tell us how developments in your nation affect the larger nation.
First of all, every one of us here have roots, and every one of us here have something to contribute. That if we can research where we're coming from, who our grandparents were, who our ancestors were, that as Indigenous people, we hold solutions, we hold ancestral knowledge that can contribute to solutions of climate change, to addressing youth leadership and the women leading, and what are those roles, and migration, especially with our young children, and what is the solutions, and what are those things that we are producing. If every one of us have roots and we're trees, what kind of fruit are we producing for the next generations, for the 7 generations, for our children and our grandchildren? That one thing that we can learn from one another is that we need to embrace that we are the ancestors of our descendants. Before, we used to look back and say, I'm the descendant of my ancestor, right? They created solutions for us. They planned for us. They organized for us. They fought for us. They loved us. They instilled in us so many different things. And for us, now we're looking forward, and we have to embrace that we are the ancestor of our descendant. That means that we all have a critical role, that every day that what we're doing and the things that we're pursuing, that is very critical, whether it's climate change, whether it's creating a better education system, that we're seeing food as medicine, that we're addressing public health, that is specifically for us, that every one of us are here, that if we come together, that interconnections that we carry is very critical, that all of us are Indigenous in one way or another. And I think sometimes we forget that. We forget it's only in rural areas, and across the world, indigenous people, we're the global majority. That indigenous people are worldwide, that we hold those solutions, and that is something that we can cultivate together to learn and to teach one another. And so, for us, it's important to know that, that it's not us that we created, that we said we're rural. It is also a label that was created that, saying that indigenous people are rural, that Navajo Nation is rural. And so, I think one point to make is that, if we all come together, and have that, and know the intersectionalities of what we're trying to accomplish together, that is something that's critical, that we have the most problems as well in the rural areas and where we come from, but we also carry the best solutions because of those problems that hold the solutions in them.
Thank you. So, Ray, tell us why it matters. You know the question.
All right, so first of all, politics. Rural America is by large the reason we have our current president. So politically it's an incredible force, which can go in one or another direction. I think most importantly though, it is where, there is even an organization called the Rural Experiment, or a project that was called the Rural Experiment. A lot of the innovations come out of rural areas. That's what we, like Brandon was just saying, I bring people from the cities into my farm, and I got to teach them everything. Everything, all the way from logical ways of looking at things to even, how you unscrew things, So that's a very important source of knowledge, wisdom, intellect, all of that. But I think most importantly, something that gets completely missed once you move into a city and all of that, is that if you call the city your home, we call rural our home. So if you matter, then we matter. And then on the other hand, we are here primarily, and in my case, because I work in agriculture and regenerative agriculture, we are really the keepers of the water, the landscape. Life itself is actually regenerated, renewed, because whether, if we do a good job in the rural areas with all of the landscape and all of that, without that, if you think of it, there is food in the urban community because there is land that is being used to produce it. We can produce some in the city, but really the vast majority is coming from us in the rural communities. The water, when the cities ignore the rural landscape, you end up like, whether it's Toledo, Ohio, or Des Moines, Iowa, spending millions of dollars to clean up the mess that comes from the rural area if that area is not given the proper respect. When we ignore that, we ignore our own ability in the survivability and the resiliency of the cities themselves. So we are all entangled in this, and we are all relatives at the end of the day. So back to the immigration story, we're all relatives. And I think, deep inside, I always wonder, why are so many people from the cities who made a lot of money moving out, buying 10, 20 acres, and then setting up these mansions, and then mowing forever, every day, Somewhere in there, I believe they still wish to be rural.
So I'm going to start this next round with Brandon. So statistically, we all know that rural and smaller town America is poorer than the rest of the country. San Francisco and New York and LA and Chicago are statistically richer, though they contain vast extremes. And that rural and smaller town places are also, on average, less educated than the big cities are. And we know all the ramifications thereof. We're talking earlier about the difference between recognizing those imbalances and thinking that rural people are only poor, are only uneducated. Say a little more about how one should think about the consequences, the complexity of being poor in a place like West Virginia.
Well, it is complex. I think that, first of all, the type of poverty we're often dealing with is generational poverty. So, there's multiple generations of experiencing lack of income, lack of decent shelter, lack of access, to good food. And that's a different thing from circumstantial poverty, where, you've had a good job and you've lost it, and now you're trying to get back in the workforce. Those are two different things. So we need to establish a workforce development and a business development system in rural places that can account for just how deep the poverty can be. But it would be a mistake to just think that all of Appalachia or all of rural places are just impoverished. I think, I'm coming from workforce development perspective. All of a sudden, I think a lot of workforce development professionals are waking up to the reality that we've pushed four-year degrees, and now we're realizing in a lot of towns it's like there's not a plumber left, there's not an HVAC technician left, and you can have a really good life and make a lot of money as a plumber, as an HVAC technician. And so people who have college degrees are not more valuable or more important or smarter than people who don't. We do need to increase access to quality of education. I think quality of education oftentimes does suffer in rural places, in large part because of declining tax bases. I mean, what we're able to pay our teachers is just criminal, really. In West Virginia, we had a teacher strike that had something to say about that, very much from the bottom up. And so we use all of our social enterprises use a 33, 6, and 3 model. That's how we organize our work week. So we hire formerly unemployed people. They're paid for 33 hours of work, just like any other business. But 6 hours a week, we are enrolled in the local community technical college. And 3 hours a week, we do life skills development. So a very holistic approach. We do celebrate higher education, but we need to not do that in a snobby way.
On that point, before asking Denisa a related question, I'll say that a big theme that Deb and I have pushed after these years of travel is that the most important part of the educational system right now is the community college network and their connections with high schools. That's where what America needs most is being done. Yes, libraries too. Yes, libraries are up there. Libraries, community colleges, and brew pubs are the three great foundations of America's future. So Denisa, there's a wonderful line that you had from an earlier discussion saying, I've learned to operate from an empowered spirit rather than from a poverty mindset. Again, this relates to how have you found it possible, not just to motivate yourself, but about changing the mindset from being impoverished to being empowered.
Okay. So first of all, I'd just like to recognize that my grandmother, who I mentioned, came here 6 times to Congress and to address the uranium contamination because her husband died from direct contamination, mining uranium on our lands during the Cold War era that the U.S. government had opened these mines. And to this day, we have over 600 abandoned uranium mines still on our land. And so part of that and learning about how did I get into this role and how as a woman coming from a matriarchal matrilineal society and also from a heritage, how do we embrace that and how do we grow into that was very critical to being who I am now, that it came from the ancestors, that it was already instilled in us. And so from my mother to my grandmother, my great-grandmother, from all of those lines, that the generational wisdom and also the knowledge that is being passed forth, it existed. And we recognize that those thoughts and also the advice that is given, the wisdom that is given is something that is generation. Like it has been coming through so many generations forth that we just keep watering it and watering those plants to be fruitful. And so for me it took a while to even embrace that because growing up I wanted to see the world. At 7 years old I said I want to see the world. I want to see what it's like to be in other parts of the world, not knowing that I would be addressing food justice and being like my grandmother and addressing injustices done to us. And so for me, that was one thing as a child, as a young woman, and even my Navajo name, Astan Yesha, that means, little lady that that we teach. And I was also taught as a young woman to take the responsibility, that as children that we're teaching that shared responsibility. I was recently in Belize last week, And the school there, what they're doing is on Fridays, they pay 1 shilling, which is about 12 cents. And they're paying to wear their rags or their street clothes and not wear the uniforms. And they pay that 1 shilling to raise money to address their bathroom and to maintain their restrooms there, because before the kids were getting sick. How are we teaching our young people to address public health? How are we instilling in them about shared responsibility and to have responsibility for the health of everyone? And this is very critical for us, organic public health, not learning from the textbooks, not learning about how to do something. The Unhealthy Foods Tax, the Healthy Donation Act didn't have a framework to learn from or a template. How do you pursue an unhealthy foods tax? Learning all these different ways of organizing is coming from ancestral knowledge. And so it's very deep and it's very emotional, it's very spiritual as well, that we're connected in those ways. And so I like to just acknowledge that and allow our young people to know that it's okay to embrace where you're coming from and embrace, who you are, because that's who we were meant to be. If I was coming from your area, I would be somebody totally different. But really embracing that, from empowered mindset is very critical to who I am now.
Thank you. And I'm going to add one sentence to that before asking Stacey to follow on. Something that also has struck us over the past 6 years of travel is, even in a nation as blended together and homogenized as the U.S. often seems to be, the sense of fromness is still very powerful in most Americans. I will always be from Southern California. My wife will always be from the Midwest. And I think what you were talking about, an extremely strong version of it, but I think there still is a sense of regional identity that many Americans have. Stacey, I'm going to give you a choice. You can either talk about how in Kentucky and Appalachia with your housing project, you've seen this shift between being impoverished and being empowered, ways that people can develop more choices. Or if you want, you can lead the discussion about what this Ashoka Fellowship has meant for you. It's up to you. You are empowered to make that choice, or both.
I hear I need your mic to do
Okay, there we go.
Oh, goodness, I have a choice. So I'm going to speak about Ashoka. I'm the oldest fellow, they say, in terms of I came in 2012. For me, I always felt when I was working on what was a huge problem, I was looking out my back door and seeing these old mobile homes, and I knew it was a problem in my region. But then I was learning, right, that there were 2 million people living in homes where they may be spending half their income on utilities alone, okay? Huge problem, right? And I was thinking about how to solve that and working with business and corporations. And I felt like that if you could leverage a business infrastructure and make tweaks along the way, that you could really change the outcomes for the end user of the product. And I felt a little weird, like I wanted to work with business, and a lot of my peers were not thinking in that way. How do I leverage a large industry to make social change? And so it was interesting to get a call from an organization I had never heard of, Ashoka. And they find you, right? And and to start having these conversations, to know that there are thousands around the world and hundreds in the U.S. that may take an issue and try to really change a whole sector in an industry, right? And it's I think from the founder that we've heard that as it's not teaching you how to fish, but maybe to change the whole fishing industry. I don't know, right? Yeah, that's a common theme. For me, it was affirmation. It was, in some ways, it was like kind of branding, that they're like, you can be called a social entrepreneur and you're going to have access to this network, and there are people that can help you along the way. And so it's been a great experience.
Like the talking stick.
Yes, it is like the talking stick. I was also thinking that Ashoka will find you. Some in the audience will also know that AARP will find you. There used to be in those horrible days after the 9/11 attacks, there was a joke that when Osama bin Laden turned 50, that was how they would track him down. Ray, I'd like you to talk both about the matter of empowerment for people who are economically challenged and also the systems change ambition that Ashoka has and that you, as a lifetime Ashoka Fellow, will now be expected to carry. Tell us about how you view systems change and your part in it. The talking stick is yours.
Well, this one works.
Okay.
Thank you, though. I got my own talking stick. That's empowerment right there.
Yeah.
Well, here's something that we may be misunderstanding, and I would like to shed some light about the whole thing about, education in rural communities. We tend to understand education as having a degree from the university. Now, my father doesn't write or read, but he's one of the most educated people in my village. So think about that for a minute. Rural America is a place where there is a lot of knowledge and wisdom, and that's just as good, unappreciated and unvalidated by the so-called educated, yet sometimes it's more valuable depending on what fate you are facing. So from that perspective, I don't think of myself or my community or the places I work with, whether it's Pine Ridge or anywhere else, as impoverished. I mean, as poor. They are impoverished, but it's the result of extraction. It's the result of a colonial system that has been grounded on extracting the wealth from every place that it touches. That is not poverty. That is something else. So we always depart from this place of empowerment, but not as in empowered to say whatever we want or to do whatever we want, but empowered to reclaim, number one, our knowledge and our wisdom, use that to then reclaim the value of the spaces and the resources that are already sitting right there. So I was supposed to be a statistic in Guatemala. I wasn't supposed to even make it to 20 years old. I was also not even poor. I was beyond poor. I was probably between misery and nothing, somewhere in there. Yet, I didn't know that. It's like the bumblebee, right? But he's not supposed to be able to fly, but he doesn't know it, so he flies anyway. That was our experience. So from that perspective, it was the UN and it was the Alliance for Progress, the USAID. They're the ones who labeled us poor. I never felt that I was poor. So the empowerment came not of ignorance or not of ignoring. I mean, what is the other word? When you just pretend that something doesn't exist. We were not poor. We actually had a lot of resources. So the difference is that we were being indoctrinated on a very different way of looking at our resources. And we, for a while, ignore the wisdom that had kept us surviving for a long time. So as we go about this work, and I think of what caused those conditions in the first place, it is the systems in place that create the conditions for those situations to come and be what they are. And so if we are going to change anything, we cannot work at the project level. We have to change the systems. So this is why we went back into how energy is transformed, because nature, for I don't know how many billions, but it has had an R&D system pretty much older than all of us. And that is way more proven, is way more resilient. And if we go back to the origin of how it works, we can actually change the system, because fundamentally, the larger system exists because it can extract. If we remove that extractive ability out of the system, it has to change. And we can outcompete on natural energy alone, a system that is based on linear thinking. So one of the things that I really appreciate is that from the beginning, Ashoka understood the difference between project level thinking and system change. Now, it is very important to also point out that to change systems is a massive undertaking, it's extremely intimidating, is depressing most of the time. You get those moments when you can grab something really good and then you live on that because it's, you got to hang on to it to keep going. Because we are so overwhelmingly overpowered by the colonizing approach that we apply to almost everything, from education to agriculture to money. And so we are here at the beginning, and I hope that we can see this highway we are trying to build. There is 4 of us here building small roads that lead into that larger highway. So, was that the question you asked?
It was close enough. So thank you. So we're just about to go to audience questions. I'd like each of you, I'll pass the talking stick down to Stacey and then work this way of what will success look like in your work 20 years from now? How will you think you've done what you hope to do?
So when I decided to do this work, I wrote a speech that started as me talking about, as a kid, riding a school bus, counting mailboxes. And then I talk about the retirement, which will coincide with probably 20 years from now, that I'm going to take the same bus and I'm going to ride it through Appalachia. Instead of, before I go there though, I started as a kid counting mailboxes. I started my career counting old mobile homes, right, across Appalachia. I'll go back in my retirement and I'll count all the new homes that were done right, all the high-quality manufactured homes, the factory-built homes, and even the site-built homes, and all the homes that my brother here repairs in Appalachia. And we will know we have made a difference. And I just want to point out that the U.S. is experiencing a real supply gap of affordable housing in the nation, right? We're about 300,000 units short every year. Factory building can fill that gap. We can do that if we fix the system. So.
One of the things that I love about Ashoka, they really help you think about scale in a very unique way that a lot of funders don't get at. And we had a really rich conversation earlier today, Rehi, about scaling with integrity. So not just trying to build a inflated, bureaucratic, huge empire of an organization, but really taking ideas and things that you're onto that are working, but replicating that through other local leaders and really ensuring that strategies and interventions continue to be owned by the communities where the strategies and interventions are taking place. So when I think about 20 years from now, it's not necessarily a huge organization, but I see many coal-based economies, not just in West Virginia, who have a renewed sense of what they can be. I think a lot of times, the coal industry experienced it was a total employment crisis around 2015. We had counties in southern West Virginia that literally had unemployment like what we had during the Great Depression, literally. And so that's scary, obviously, and it's painful. But you kind of go through the stages of grief, and then you realize, well, okay, if we're not going to be the billion-dollar coal fields anymore, then what are we going to be? And then the answer to that can be lots of different things. So 20 years from now, I see many different extraction-based communities where we're partnering that have a diversified economy made up of lots of different kinds of businesses with many unique and diverse entrepreneurs leading those businesses.
Thank you. I think one of the greatest things about being a part of Ashoka is that, and this is emotional because my family, my parents, and my ancestors did not many times have the power of choice to dream. And Ashoka has helped me to get that out of me. And I have a long list of what success looks like. But I think we're already at this point successful and doing something that no one has ever done before in writing definitions of what unhealthy food is, that it never existed before. And part of the successes that I see in 20 years is an indigenous healthcare system, an indigenous facility that provides a holistic approach to healthcare, with all of these different approaches from around the world, integrating that as food as medicine, and as well as honoring data sovereignty, that our indigenous researchers are a part of research, that they're accepted, that they're not invalidated as well. And I also see that people should know and also understand that fry bread is not an indigenous food. And sometimes we're called the FBI, the fry bread investigators. And so many times we are talking about how to decolonize our diet. And I think even the values that we are passing on to our children is that they should accept, not to be fast, cheap, and easy. And that is coming with, the values of what fast food and unhealthy food and processed foods are. And so there's a ton of things that I see, but also the decrease of diabetes, that in our communities, there are many amputations that are being performed right now. And how do we learn from communities like from Cuba and from other indigenous places that have traditional medicines that are healing, and those that are suffering from that? How do we create solutions for that? And as well, raising a new generation of women leaders. That one day that my tribal council will be all women. That one day that, that I'm going to see that in my generation, that it's not going to be only 3 women on our tribal council right now. It's going to be all of them. And reclaiming that our tribal government as well, that right now it's a replication of the US government, that we will return to the way that we used to organize ourselves and govern ourselves, that was whole for everybody, that was healing for everybody, that everyone had a place in government and in politics. And so from our work, driving change and creating new roles for society is implementing ways for our youth and our elders to be a part of the process, to write legislation, introduce legislation that has never been done before. So my dream list goes on, but one thing is that fry bread is not part of our type.
Say that my ancestral people in Scotland now feature fried Snickers and fried Twinkies. So I share that part of your dream. Ray, you can wrap this up.
All right, so if I have it my way, there will be happy chickens, there will be happy farmers, and healthy consumers. But what success looks like really is way beyond that. Chickens are just the center of a 14 set of enterprises that we can stack next to each other to build whole ecosystems that are integrated, that are holistic. That will be the map of what it looks like. More specifically, to tip this over and to address this issue of scale in the short term, in average, everybody consumes around 20 chickens in this country. Okay? Not everybody eats chickens, of course, but about 20. All right, we want one of those chickens to be raised regeneratively with integrity, not just by name, but actually with integrity. Well, except Annie, it's way more than 20, but that's a conversation for another day. And we want also to have 12 and a half eggs, which is also 5% of the total of eggs that a individual consumes. If we do that, and also if we do it in partnership with Native communities, we will have tackled a $3 billion industry. We would have created a $3 billion regenerative poultry industry and all of the associated industries around it, which will completely regenerate this country's base so that we can then build on that. Not only that, but it would engage about 2.5 million out of the 56 million already in the hands of Native communities, which Native communities, by the way, that already have the wisdom, already have the historical and ancestral commitment to regenerative farming, is where regenerative farming started to begin with. And not only that, if we spread this, and with Ashoka's ecosystem we can do that, we were just talking about that a few minutes ago, then we can tackle the 20% of the landscape globally that is still populated by 370 Aboriginal groups, millions of Aboriginal people. That's what success looks like. But if we do that, guess what's going to happen? Many more farmers beyond indigenous are going to adopt this, and then we win.
What a wonderful set of success markers. We have time for a couple of questions before who has a question? Yes, in the far back.
Thank you so much. Given the lack of internet, infrastructure, fewer roads, lower population density, how do you think about scale in rural America in ways I feel like all the case studies we have are for cities, right, where you just go down the street and pass thousands of people. How do you reach?
So Brandon has the talking stick.
The question's about scale in a rural setting. You've got bad roads, internet connection problems. It can be so overwhelming. Rural America is actually the perfect place for like economic R&D, is what we call it. And if you know, we're based out of Wayne, West Virginia. It's a town of about 1,000 people. So our first social enterprise was a construction company that improved energy efficiency for housing units. So we put 12 people who were unemployed back to work in decent paying jobs through our construction company. We also enrolled all 12 in the local community colleges. So in a town of 1,000, you've now just made a significant dent in the unemployment problem, in the labor participation problem, which is actually even more serious in rural America, and you've made a dent in the poverty rate because we're intentionally hiring people out of poverty. So I think a lot of times in rural America, it's a mistake to think about solutions at an urban type scale. You know, West Virginia has 1.8 million people in the entire state. So, how many? There are cities that quadruple that, you know, in this country. But again, if well thought out solutions at proper scale can have a really, really outsized impact compared to what they might in a rural setting.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact composition of this audience, but I have to imagine if you see there's part government, part industry, part academia, anyone can take this who has an answer or wants to, but what would your audience ask be if there's something that can kind of, either as consumers or as professionals, you know, what would be the ask about how we can practice it?
What would you like the audience of influential people to do? So we'll go down. Yes.
All right, well, eat regenerative chicken to begin with. It's called tree range, by the way, because it's grown under the original environment of the chicken, which is canopies. But no, that is serious. But also, there is scale, some scalable projects that we are putting forth. For example, we just launched the 1 million hazelnut campaign. Hazelnut is another underestimated resource. It's native to 2/3 of the continental U.S. It can supplant soybeans in terms of biomass production per acre. Needs no tilling. It lasts up to 35 years. Is resilient. Is all of those things. Can actually draw carbon, clean the water, all of those things, and provide feed for the chickens and other animals. The Million Hazelnut campaign, millionhazelnut.com, needs your support right now from policies so that we can clean water and all of that, perennialize the landscape again, also create new industries, and it's only $7 a hazelnut. So for the price of a Starbucks visit, you can actually start perennializing the landscape.
So brief ask from each of you. Yes, Lisa, yes.
I think one of the biggest asks is that we need to support indigenous public health systems when it comes to the frameworks of policy development and evaluation and advocacy. And that is something that we advocate for, and also as well as funding, supporting local efforts. 3% of the funding goes to indigenous people, so we become competitors among each other in communities. And another ask is to pursue taste education. Let's create taste playgrounds. Let's reprogram our tongue, you know, that we will have biodiversity, you know, on our palate, you know, that it'll be something that we can teach our children, you know, when you're eating, to save seeds. You know, when you're eating, you'll really question, you know, where this food is coming from and what can we do with this food and how can we contribute and teach our young people about food, and also the future of food, learning about, you know, the plants and the roots and the insects that is going to save us all, you know, eventually. And there's so many other plants and plant animals and relatives that we need to learn from on an international scale. So a lot of many, you know, things that you could do and also advocate for, but come and visit us. come and learn from us, embrace us. Let's unite. Let's work together to address these issues that we have together.
It would be a lie to say that funding doesn't help. But better than that is to do business with us. We have a lot to offer. At Coalfield Development, we're making really cool products. We offer great services. There's lots of other entrepreneurs just like me and lots of other businesses just like Coalfield Development. Do business with us.
Each of you in your local communities can support affordable housing. You hear the phrase, not in my backyard. You can show up in your town council, city council, zoning, and you can advocate for it. You can also know that what was an innovation in Appalachia has been replicated in urban America. We're doing this work in Los Angeles, San Bernardino, so you can help open the door for this type of innovation.
So our panelists will be here to talk with you afterwards. We're reached the end of our program. Please join me in giving a sincere thanks again to Stacey, Brandon, Denisa.